Okay, so where we're starting is kind of with our memories of how we came to this work and what we were working on, what we were thinking about, what we were hoping for, and I'm thinking as we're talking together that this work was founded in a very collaborative atmosphere and context of a group of women coming together, Jean Baker Miller being at the center of this group, and really all of us feeling that what was presented as theory about human nature and about women was not correct, that people actually hadn't been listening to the voices, the many different voices of women, and that we were trying to listen to those voices in a different way, partly based on the work of Jean Baker Miller in 1976 in her book Toward a New Psychology of Women. Yeah.
I really would like to ask, because I know I wasn't a part of it then, but, went on to actually form the Institute. But, what always strikes me is, even historically, I often literally try to imagine the four of you sitting in a living room, in Jean's living room, but sitting there, and where you got the strength to overcome this huge power differential. How a group of four women, granted you had your own power, but I've often wondered, where in the world did you get the chutzpah to say, let's go out with this?
Well, Jean had already paved the way, in a way, with her book, Toward a New Psychology of Women, and none of us individually would have been able to go out and take on the traditional psychological theory. In general, I would say, not just about women, but the psychological theory that emphasized individualism, separation, go on your own, because that was the prevailing theory at the time in 1978 when this started. But we had each other supporting each other. And, the phrase I always use is listening each other into voice. So, I remember on occasion the four of us sitting there and saying, gee, we don't have anything that's that important to say. And then others of us saying, you do have something to say. This is important. And how much we needed that support, that individually I think it would have been very hard to start chipping away at some of the existing theory, psychological theory, which was all about separation, all about the self, not very much about context, not very much about power dynamics. And we started presenting at Wellesley in 1981 in the symposium that were given. And I don't know, when did you start?
Yeah, I think it was probably in the early 90s. When I came to the work, I was also reading a lot at the time and cared a lot about social identity development, specifically racial identity development. And I remember being in a room with some women in Texas that you, Irene, Jan and Jean had a lot of contact with, and they were the carriers of the model out at the University of Texas. And I saw how they were doing therapy, or trying to teach those of us who were students how to do therapy. And it was one of the first times I saw a healing model that didn't involve first shaming the client. It was totally listening to the person's experience, not telling her, well, in order to be a strong woman, because the other part of the context was this was sort of, I am woman, hear me roar. And so the risk is that women were susceptible to going into a therapy office and hearing, what's wrong with you? And so this was totally about affirming experience, totally about affirming connection to the whole experience. So that was one thing that drew me in. And knowing that there were these women here in Massachusetts doing that, literally is why I came to Massachusetts. Quite literally. Quite literally is why I came to Massachusetts. Then the other part was, in reading about social identity development, it was, I was reading something Judy wrote, and Jean in her that very powerful paper, Connections, Disconnections,
and
and
Violations.
Yes.
Mhm.
And the theme over and over was that chronic disconnection is the primary source of human suffering. And the obvious question for me is that if chronic disconnection is a primary source of human suffering, what if the culture itself is an active agent of disconnection? What if it's not just about interpersonal relationships and trying to do those better or getting out of them or separating from them? How do we account for culture, not just as context, as sort of a backdrop for all the action, but taking into account that we are literally breathing in, we're ingesting culture every day through images, messages, and transactions. And your original work that talked about how we get to know who we are through action and relationship. How does this evolving sense of self come to be in interaction with a power over culture?
Yeah.
Right.
And that was the big question for me, and that's the question that I've been struggling with, and have had the good fortune of working with the three of you
Yeah.
and others all over the nation, really.